The CISSP is the premier security certification around the world, and now even recognized as the equivalent of a master's degree in the UK. Pretty fancy. Today we're going to dive into the first of 8 lessons as I attempt to help you get further faster in preparing for the CISSP exam. We have a lot of material to cover today, so let's get to it. So the CISSP exam consists of 8 domains of knowledge around security. And today we're focused on domain 1, which is security and risk management. Do bear in mind that you have to pass each individual domain within the exam, or it's an overall fail. So today we're focused on domain 1, and over the next few weeks I'll release a lesson for each of the 8 domains. So essentially you'll have one lesson for each exam domain, plus I'll release 5 to 10 shorter supplemental lessons on challenging topics or exam strategies, one of which actually already exists, and that's my strategy for hacking your CISSP exam prep. And in there I explain how I passed the CISSP on my first attempt with around 12 hours of dedicated study spread over a couple of weeks. Frequently within this series, you are going to hear me refer to the official CISSP exam study guide because for less than $60 US, you get 1,300 practice questions. You get 700 flashcards, great resources to go back and test your recall on important exam topics. And if you get the e-book version, you have searchable key terms at that point. So it makes a great resource to accelerate your preparation. You can buy it on Amazon.com. I have a link in the video description to the best price I could find over there for the new book. And on the topic of free things to help you prepare, if you haven't bought the study guide yet and you want to just check your knowledge, I do have a 50-question CISSP practice quiz available to you free. No login required. Link in the description. Give it a shot. See where you fall today. If you want to assess your current state, here's your chance. Is your frontline support struggling with too many Microsoft Cloud portals? Now they can manage Office 365 users and devices directly from Microsoft Teams using Simon, the AI-powered chatbot for the Microsoft Cloud. A link with more info in the video description. So now let's get into lesson 1, which is domain 1, security and risk management. I want to start by having a look at the exam outline with you. And the outline we're looking at here is lifted straight from the official CISSP exam outline from the ISC Squared website, but I want to break down domain 1 with you. I'll have you a link to this document in the description on this video. But just going through the skills measured, so to speak, for domain 1, you need to understand and apply concepts related to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, what we call the CIA triad. Very important that you know this. Security governance principles. We'll talk about compliance. You need to understand legal and regulatory issues in a global context. What this section means at the end of the day is you have a lot of memorization to do here. There are a lot of specific laws you'll want to be able to recall and to understand the gist. They really cover the basics of legal and regulatory as it relates to information security. You won't get into the nitty-gritty of the laws, but there's going to be a lot of memorization that I'll help you with there. You need to promote, understand, and adhere to professional ethics. ISC Squared has their own code of ethics that you will be expected to know well. You need to understand the difference between policy, standards, procedures, and guidelines. We'll cover this so the differences are clear and you know where they fit in your strategy. You'll be expected to identify, analyze, and prioritize business continuity requirements. So think preparing for disaster, contributing and enforcing security policies and procedures. And notice that says personnel security policies and procedures. So there's a people management element to this. You know, other than cryptography, you're going to find that many or even most of the topics in the CISSP come from a perspective of information security management. Certainly there are technical elements to all of these concepts, but outside of cryptography, most of them have some of that management focus. You'll need to understand and apply risk management concepts as well as threat modeling concepts. So 1.9 and 1.10 are huge. and they involve frameworks. You're going to need to do some learning and memorization here. I find that nobody walks in just ready to hit those right off the bat. Apply risk-based management concepts to the supply chain. And you see that word apply a lot because there are many real-world questions that come in to play in CISSP. It's not just a theoretical exam. So all this knowledge isn't of much use if you can't apply it in the real world. And then establishing and maintaining security awareness education and training. Most organizations today have regular security awareness sessions for their end users. But there are layers to education in the security space, and what you need for your users is obviously different from what you need for your analysts and your decision makers. So just to recap some key areas that we need to focus on. So understanding risk and the risk analysis process, being able to apply that process. Threat modeling concepts and processes, and the frameworks that go with those two. Compliance, legal, regulatory, privacy, professional ethics. You need to know that ISC squared code by heart. Security governance principles will definitely come into play. And then again, security policy, standards, procedures, and guidelines. We need to know the difference between these four. You definitely need to understand what's suggested and what's mandatory. The CISSP will definitely test your ability to filter through all the details and to bring to the surface what is most important in selecting that best answer. And I'm going to try to help you everywhere I can by pointing out some of those key consideration points that will help you make the right decision on exam day. So I mentioned you're going to need to know the CIA triad by heart. So CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You'll sometimes see this expressed visually in the form of a triangle, with confidentiality being the first, followed by integrity and availability. So confidentiality is about secrecy or privacy, and in the technology context, that means access controls that help ensure only authorized subjects, be those people or services, can access objects, whether that object is data or a system. So integrity, ensures that our data or system configurations are not modified without authorization. If a threat actor modifies data without authorization, we've now lost integrity. That data is now no longer true and reliable. And confidentiality and integrity don't matter if we don't have availability. So authorized requests for objects, those systems, that data must be granted to subjects within a reasonable amount of time. The CIA triad is covered in Chapter 1 of the official CISSP study guide. You'll want to know CIA very well for the exam. Definitely going to come up. I mentioned the CISSP Code of Ethics. I'm not going to read you the full code here, but at a high level, it covers protecting society, infrastructure, the Commonwealth, acting in a manner that is honest and responsible and legal, providing competent service to others, and to advance and protect the profession. The Code of Ethics itself is much longer than this. You want to give the whole thing a quick read, and personally, I find most of what's in here is common sense, but you'll want to have some familiarity with the terminology they use in here in case it comes up on a question. So I want to shift gears and talk about security policy development. So at a top tier, security policy is your document that defines the scope of security that's needed by our organization, the assets that need to be protected, and to the extent we should go to protect them. But there are 4 levels of security policy development. So it starts with acceptable use policy, which is designed to assign roles within an organization and to tie responsibility to those roles. Then we have security baselines, which define a minimum level of security that every system in the organization needs to meet. Then we have security guidelines, which offer recommendations on how standards and baselines should be implemented. And these provide operational guidance for both our security professionals and our users. And then finally, we have procedures, which are those detailed step-by-step documents that describe the exact actions that are necessary to implement a specific security mechanism, a control, or a solution in protecting our data or infrastructure. So a tidbit for the exam. When you're developing new safeguards, you're establishing a new baseline, a new security baseline, which means that maintaining compliance with existing baselines is not a valid consideration point. Now let's move on to risk management and risk analysis. And I want to start with risk category. So a category is a group of potential causes of risk. So at a high level, you have damage, which results in physical loss of an asset or an inability to access that asset. And then when it comes to information, we have disclosure and disclosing critical information regardless of where or how it was disclosed. If this was a malicious act as a result of a threat actor or unintentional on the part of a well-meaning user. And we have losses. So losses might be permanent or temporary, which could include altered data or inaccessible data. So data altered without authorization affects integrity if we think about it from a CIA perspective. And then if you think of an attack like ransomware, for example, which renders data inaccessible and permanently inaccessible unless we can recover. And then we have risk factors. And factors are something that increase risk or susceptibility to loss. So in the realm of risk factors, we have physical damage, natural disasters, power loss, vandalism. We have malfunctions, so whether that's a failure of a system or a network or a peripheral or the HVAC system. We have attacks. Now, these are purposeful acts of a threat actor, whether that's from the inside or the outside, like unauthorized disclosure, for example. So continuing on risk factors, human errors. Now, these are usually considered accidental incidents where attacks are generally purposeful incidents. Then finally, we have application errors, which would be failures of the application, including potentially the operating system. Now, security planning may come up on the exam, and there are three types of plans you need to be familiar with. The first is the strategic plan. This is the long-term plan. It's fairly stable. It should generally include a risk assessment, and the strategic plan typically has a 5-year horizon, and you'll update it annually. This helps to align the goals of the security function with the organization's missions and objectives. The next one is the tactical plan. This is a midterm plan. It's developed to provide a little more details on the goals of the strategic plan. This is typically going to have a horizon of about 1 year. The tactical plan gives us a little more flexibility. We can make some ad hoc adjustments here when circumstances dictate. And the final plan of the three is the operational plan. So this is a short-term, highly detailed plan that drills down on the strategic and the tactical plans. And by short term, we're typically talking about monthly or quarterly. The operational plan will have budgetary figures, staffing assignments, scheduling, and typically step-by-step implementation procedures. So now let's talk about response to risk. So we have several ways we can respond to risk. The first is risk acceptance, and that means simply doing nothing. We simply accept the risk and the potential loss if the threat occurs. And if the safeguards or countermeasures outweigh the potential loss in terms of their cost, then just simply accepting a risk might make sense. The next option is risk mitigation, or sometimes you'll hear this called risk reduction. And when we mitigate risk, we implement a countermeasure and we accept the residual risk. That's the risk that's left over once our safeguards, our security controls are in place. Now, in risk assignment, this is also called risk transference. We're transferring or assigning that risk to a third party, like in purchasing insurance against damage. And outsourcing to companies with specific expertise is another way we commonly see risk assigned or transferred. So next is risk avoidance. So when the cost of mitigating or accepting a risk are higher than the benefits of the service itself, then avoidance is a good idea. So for example, I might decide to locate a business in Kansas instead of Florida to avoid hurricanes. If I decide that the cost of mitigating the risk of hurricane damage to my business is too great. So continuing down this road, risk deterrence is another potential response. And implementing deterrence to would-be violators of security and policy is a pretty common response in the real world. And deterrence would include things like implementing an audit policy to deter folks from malicious behavior, for example, in the IT department. Security cameras are security guards to deter unauthorized entry onto our premises. Or even something as simple as warning signage. And then finally, we have risk rejection. And I want to point out this is generally considered an unacceptable response. It's a possibility, but it's not acceptable. This means to simply reject or ignore the risk, just treat it as though it doesn't exist. Obviously, never a good idea to just bury our head in the sand because problems don't just go away. But remember, handling risk is not a one-time process. This is an area you're going to have to revisit on a recurring basis and refresh your responses to risks and to determine if the nature of these risks has shifted in some way and require changes on your part. So let's talk about risk management frameworks. Now, the primary risk management framework referenced on the CISSP exam is the NIST 800-37 framework, and that's currently in revision 2. If you'd like to read it end to end, I'll have a link to 800-37 and its latest revision down in the description for this video. Now, you'll also hear some other risk management frameworks mentioned, but I want to point something out here. So from the CISSP study guide, it says, consider the following risk management frameworks for use in the real world. So the key there is for use in the real world. So they mention Octave and FAIR and TARA, and the fact that they say consider these for use in the real world while mentioning that NIST 800-37 is the primary framework, that tells me I'm not going to worry much about these. I'm going to focus on NIST 800-37. Now, this NIST framework establishes a process, steps, and with any process in CISSP, you need to make sure you know these steps in order. And really, it's depicted by some as a preparatory step followed by 6 main steps. I'm going to just give you the 7 steps. So when we talk about that preparatory step, preparing to execute the risk management framework is that preparatory step. So if you ever see NIST 837 presented as 6 steps, it's because they leave the prepare off. So second step is categorizing your information systems. And we're looking at the information processed, stored, and transmitted by the system based on analysis of the potential impact for loss. Next is selecting security controls. So we need an initial set of controls for the system and to tailor those controls to our reality to reduce risk to an acceptable level based on our risk assessment. Step 4, we implement security controls. And we describe or document how those controls are employed within our systems and our environment. And then we're going to assess those controls to determine if they're implemented correctly, if they're operating as we intended in our environment, and most importantly, are they producing the desired outcomes? Are they meeting our security and privacy requirements and expectations? So next, we authorize the system. And by that, I mean we authorize the system to operate in a normal environment, and at that point, the organization is accepting the risk formally for the system. And because this is not a one-time event, risk management is a process. Step 7 is monitoring our security controls, periodically assessing that our controls are effective, documenting any changes to the system, and conducting risk assessments periodically as necessary. And remember, I mentioned this is a process, right? For any process in CISSP, we need to know those steps. We want to know them in order. Some folks will use a mnemonic device or a memory device, it's called, using the first letters of these steps in the framework. So for example, for these letters, for PCSIAAM, I could use the mnemonic device, people can see I am always monitoring. So at test time, if I'm a little foggy on NIST 800-37, I can at least get the first letter of each of these 7 steps, by remembering my mnemonic device. People can see I am always monitoring. That was something we did very commonly with the OSI model back in the day, and we'll talk about that in a later domain in this series. And a few other things for the exam. So do remember, when you're talking about risk management and risk analysis, not every risk can be mitigated. That's just a fact. And it's management's job to decide how that risk is handled. So when you hear me talk about thinking like a manager when you're taking the CISSP exam, remember it's the role of a security professional to be a risk advisor, to advise the decision maker who is the manager. And also, when multiple priorities are present, always remember human safety is the most important. I bring that up now. It may not even come up as a part of this domain, but it's an important point, so I wanted to just mention it early on here lest I forget. Remember to prioritize human safety when you're presented with many options. And remember, when legal issues are involved, calling an attorney is a valid choice. It might not seem like a valid choice because as technical folks, you may want to solve every problem, but when we put our manager hat on, calling an attorney is a great example of risk transference, right? Or assignment. We're outsourcing our problem to an expert. So let's talk for a moment about types of risk. So residual, inherent, and total are three types of risk. So we have residual risk, which is the risk that remains even when all our conceivable safeguards are in place. That's the risk we can't get rid of. And at that point, the risk management function has chosen to accept rather than to mitigate or transfer or assign that residual risk. Sometimes there's a bit of risk there we just can't shake. So we're accepting. Then there's inherent risk, newly identified risk not yet addressed with risk management strategies. So another way of saying that is it's inherent risk is risk that exists in the absence of controls. And this is one that you don't really see in every CISSP text. I bring it up because I've seen it a time or two, and it's worthy of mentioning. But total risk is the other that you want to be very familiar with, and that's the amount of risk an organization would face if no safeguards were implemented. So to say it another way, if we just look at those three types of risk, residual risk is after controls are implemented. That's the risk that remains. Inherent risk is risk that exists before we've implemented our safeguards, and then total risks would be the risk present without any safeguards. So for the exam, you really want to focus on residual risk and total risk. These are going to come up in a formula. And this is the first time I've mentioned formulas, but formulas are very much a thing when we talk about risk analysis and management on the CISSP exam. So a few tidbits for the exam. So be able to explain total risk, residual risk, and the controls gap, which is the amount of risk that's reduced by implementing safeguards. We'll see controls gap in a formula and talk about that a bit more a little later in this installment. So to calculate total risk, know this formula. Threats times vulnerabilities times asset value equals total risk. And we'll look at some of these formulas later in this installment because you will need to understand the several formulas as they relate to risk and how to use them to arrive at good decisions. So we can also express risk itself as a formula, and risk can be defined as threat times vulnerability. So yes, threat and vulnerability are expressed as numeric values, as probabilities. So stick with me to the end of the video. We'll see more formulas here, and we'll look at a couple of examples to help you get the ball rolling. And when we're done, if maybe you'd like to see a video dedicated to nothing but the formulas that are going to come up for you on the CISSP exam, just leave me a comment and I can make that happen. So I want to shift gears now from risk to risk analysis. So there are two ways at the highest level to evaluate risk to our assets. There's qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. So quantitative assigns a dollar value to evaluate the effectiveness of our countermeasures. Quantitative risk analysis really is the more labor intensive of the two methodologies. It employs typically a lot of data collection and analysis using cost benefit analysis. It results in specific values. Though what we're doing is removing guesswork and opinions from the process. It's really, if I were to describe quantitative risk analysis in one word, it's objective. It requires a lot of information and effort typically, but at the end of the day, it's going to assign a tangible dollar value so we can evaluate the effectiveness of our response to risk. So let's look at the risk analysis steps involved in quantitative risk analysis. So this is specific to quantitative risk analysis. We're going to talk about qualitative in a moment. So step one is inventorying your assets and assigning a value. And you might be asking yourself, what's that text out there in red? I'm putting some terms and some acronyms out here because these are going to come up in formulas that we discuss later in this module. So these are going to be important. You'll wind up revisiting this slide to perhaps think again through these steps and what the outputs of the step are. So step two, we're identifying threats. We're going to research our assets. We're going to produce a list of all the possible threats to each asset. And here we're going to calculate EF, which is the exposure factor, and the SLE, which is the single loss expectancy. We're going to get to what these mean in just a moment. I just want to set the stage for you so you know what some of these outputs are, and this will all come together when we talk about the formulas. Step three, you'll perform a threat analysis to calculate the likelihood of each threat being realized within a single calendar year. You're calculating the annualized rate of occurrence. Again, that acronym, it's going to show up in a formula here momentarily. Step four, we're going to estimate the potential loss by calculating the annualized loss expectancy. And the fact that the word annual or the concept of yearly is coming up here should tell you that this process is an ongoing process, right? This is a recurring process we're going to revisit periodically within our organization. It's not a one-time exercise. Step five, we're going to research countermeasures for each threat, and then we're going to calculate changes to the annualized rate of occurrence. So in other words, how often is this event going to occur? And what is our annualized loss expectancy based on the countermeasures that we've applied? So if we've done our job right, the annualized rate of occurrence and the annualized loss expectancy are going to be lower than when we started. In step six, we're going to perform a cost-benefit analysis of each of our countermeasures for each threat, for each asset, to determine in a very dollars and cents fashion if we've made good decisions in our selection of countermeasures. So let's talk about qualitative risk analysis. So qualitative risk analysis uses a scoring system to rank threats and the effectiveness of our countermeasures relative to the system and the environment. It requires guesswork and estimation. It definitely uses opinions. However, it does provide meaningful results. If I could summarize qualitative risk analysis in one word, it would be subjective, because it involves opinions. And while it's going to tend to be less accurate, it is a quick way we can make some estimations that we can then use to guide our efforts in the deeper quantitative risk analysis. So a lot of times qualitative risk analysis can serve as that way we take a 5-minute rough cut at the problems we're dealing with. I can rank impacts as low, medium, high. I can throw out some percentages to just get to a point that I know what I'm dealing with in terms of the probability and impact of the threats we're working with, of the risk we're trying to deal with. You should be familiar with the Delphi technique for the exam as well. So in qualitative risk analysis, this is basically anonymous feedback and response used to arrive at a consensus. A couple of other considerations when it comes to risk analysis. There's loss potential. So what would be lost if the threat agent is successful in exploiting a vulnerability? And then delayed loss. And this is the amount of loss that can occur over time, because the reality is you don't lose everything all at once in certain situations. For example, if an exploit takes down your firewall in front of your web farm, and your web farm is unavailable, you lose money over time as customers can't reach your website. That's delayed loss. And I mentioned threat agents here. The threat agents are what cause the threats by exploiting vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities are the weaknesses in your assets or in your safeguards, for that matter. So I promised you we would talk about those important formulas, and that time has come. So we're going to talk about the relevant terms and the formulas that we use to calculate their results. So we have exposure factor, single loss expectancy, annualized rate of occurrence, annualized loss expectancy, and safeguard evaluation. So these all factor into some key formulas that are definitely going to show up on the CISSP exam. So let's dig into these terms and the formulas that go along with them. So we'll start with exposure factor, EF. This is the percentage of loss that an organization would experience if a specific asset were violated by a realized risk. So this is a percentage of loss. So EF, or exposure factor, is expressed as a percentage. Single loss expectancy, or SLE. So this represents the cost associated with a single realized risk against a specific asset. So this gives us a one-time loss figure. So the formula for single loss expectancy is the asset value times the exposure factor. So the asset value is going to be a number, a dollar figure. The exposure factor will be a percentage, which is expressed as a decimal when we're doing the math. So let's look at a sample here. So if I have an asset value on the left here of $100,000, and a tornado is estimated to do 30% damage to my asset, so that's going to be 0.3. My exposure factor is 30%, and my single loss expectancy then would be $30,000, or the asset value times the exposure factor. Okay, this is just the tip of the iceberg, so let's keep going here. So annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO. So this is the expected frequency with which a specific threat or risk will occur within a single year. So the annual rate of occurrence is an important input for this next item, and that is annualized loss expectancy. So this is the possible yearly cost of all instances of a specific realized threat against a specific asset. So if we look at that in a formula, the annualized loss expectancy, the ALE, is the single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. So the SLE is the one-time loss, and then we take that times the annualized rate of occurrence. So if we have an SLE of $50,000 and we have an annualized rate of occurrence of, say, 0.5, because a particular threat only occurs once every 2 years, 50,000 times 0.5 is 25,000. So I've explained that simply there, but I started with an SLE we'd already calculated. Let me take you through an end-to-end example of annualized loss expectancy. So we have an office building that's worth $200,000, and we estimate that hurricane damage would be 50% of the value of this building, and hurricane probability is 1 every 10 years, so 10%, or 0.1. Okay, so we have to start by calculating the single loss expectancy, right? So the single loss expectancy is the $200,000 building times the damage estimate of 50%, or 0.5. So our SLE is $100,000. Now we're going to take that SLE, and that factors into our ALE equation. So we'll carry that $100,000 into the next equation here, and that is the single loss expectancy of $100,000 times the annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO, and our hurricane probability is 1 every 10 years, so the annualized rate of occurrence is 0.1. So if a hurricane probability was 1 every single year, that would be 1 even, right? But 1 every 10 years means 0.1, so we take that 100,000 times 0.10, and our annualized loss expectancy is $10,000. So what this tells us is that the safeguards we put in place better not cost more than $10,000 a year, or we're spending more to protect this building than we're essentially going to save. So that gives us the value of the safeguard. So while we're on that subject, that gives you a dollars and cents answer, right? So while we're on that subject, let's talk about how the value of the safeguard is expressed then. So we call that safeguard evaluation. So good security controls will mitigate risk. They're transparent to users. They're difficult to bypass, but the last one here, they're also cost effective. So in our previous example, we saw that the safeguard shouldn't cost us more than $10,000 a year, or we were spending too much relative to the reduction in loss. So safeguard evaluation has a formula. So it's the annualized loss expectancy before the safeguard minus the annualized loss expectancy after the safeguard minus the annual cost of the safeguard. That gives us the value of the safeguard. So we're really trying to answer the question, is the safeguard cost effective? If we're spending more to protect an asset than we're saving in ALE, then we don't have a cost effective answer there. So there's your formula expressed a little more simply. So ALE before the safeguard minus ALE after the safeguard minus the annual cost of the safeguard. So again, I hope these examples have been helpful. If you need more help with formulas, if we need to do a video with just the formulas, go down to the comments, drop me a note, let me know. We can make it happen. So the amount of risk reduced by implementing safeguards is known as the controls gap. And to see controls gap in a formula, we can look at residual risk then. So residual risk is total risk. So the risk in absence of controls minus the controls gap gives us that remaining or residual risk. So if total risk is $100,000, the controls gap is $50,000. Our residual then is $50,000. So the CISSP exam will also test your knowledge of applying risk-based management concepts to the supply chain. So today, most services are delivered through a chain of multiple entities. That is to say, one product, like a car, for example, while it has a car company's label on it, likely includes components from multiple companies. And certainly it may be transported by multiple companies to the dealership. So a secure supply chain includes vendors who are secure, they're reliable, they're trustworthy, they're reputable, and you need to evaluate the vendors in your supply chain to ensure that's true. So when evaluating third parties in the chain, you want to consider methodologies like on-site assessment, visiting an organization, interviewing personnel, and observing their operating habits to ensure they are as safe as they claim to be. Document exchange and review. And this means to investigate the means by which this organization exchanges data sets and documentation, as well as the formal processes by which they perform assessments and reviews. There's process or policy review, so requesting copies of their security policies, their processes, or procedures. And you could finally opt for a third-party audit, so having an independent auditor provide an unbiased review of an entity's security infrastructure. But you want to dig into supply chain evaluation from a risk management perspective for the exam. You're going to be expected to have good knowledge there. So let's talk about threat modeling. So this is the security process where potential threats are identified, categorized, and analyzed. So the key phrase there is potential threats. So threat modeling can be proactive or reactive, but in either case, the goal is to eradicate or reduce threats. And there are different approaches you can take to threat modeling. So common approaches include focus on assets, and a focus on assets uses asset valuation results to identify threats to the most valuable assets. The model could focus on attackers, so identifying potential attackers and identifying threats based on the attacker's goals. And a software company might consider potential threats against the software they develop, so focused on software. So the exam essentials section in the official CISSP study guide mentions you should be familiar with a few different threat modeling methodologies. So let's talk about a couple of those briefly. First, there's the STRIDE model, which comes from Microsoft. So STRIDE is an acronym that stands for Spoofing, Tampering, Repudiation, Information Disclosure, Denial of Service, and Elevation of Privilege. It's essentially a threat categorization scheme. There is the PASTA model, which focuses on controls relative to asset value. So it's a risk-centric approach that aims to select and develop countermeasures in relation to the values of the assets you're protecting. A pretty good dollars and cents methodology. And there are 7 steps or stages in PASTA, which are listed here. You're going to want to make sure you have familiarity with these methodologies. And remember, when you're dealing with any sort of multi-step or multi-phase process or methodology, understanding the order of the steps in that methodology will be important, at least to memorize those. So there's going to be some memorization work on these items for sure. There's the VAST model, which is based on Agile Project Management and Programming principles. So VAST is also an acronym: Visual, Agile, Simple, Threat. It's actually Visual, Agile, and Simple Threat. And then we have the TRIKE model. So the TRIKE model also takes a risk-based approach and ultimately provides a method of performing a security audit and how many users are likely to be affected by the attack as a percentage. And discoverability, how hard is it for the attacker to discover the weaknesses? But these are all threat modeling methodologies that you're expected to know a bit about for the exam. So make sure you dig in to DREAD and STRIDE and TRIKE and PASTA and VAST. So another step in threat modeling, quite commonly, is diagramming potential attacks. So determining potential attack concepts is achieved through visualizing your infrastructure and identifying threats or identifying potential vulnerabilities that may be exploited. So let me just sketch out a simple example for you here. So let's diagram some potential attacks. So I have users that come through my perimeter, my user web server boundary, we'll call it. So they hit my web service here. And I have a database back here, a SQL server where we'll pull some data from a database. So my user starts by logging in to the web service. At some point, they may make a request that then causes that web service to go back and retrieve data from my SQL database. I'd imagine there's maybe even a different authentication process here from a service principal or an entity down to that database versus the user logging in manually here. And I can perceive different threats here because I'm visualizing. So just right off the cuff, I can imagine that on a login form, brute force password attacks, dictionary attacks might be common if attackers wanted to just guess at usernames and passwords. And if they were to register for our service, maybe they could get an idea of the username requirements and then just start, as I mentioned, a dictionary attack. Now, if I think about a web service talking to a database, the first thing that always comes to mind is SQL injection. So as an attacker, I could try to exploit maybe some poor value handling on a web form to perform a SQL injection attack. And I'm out of space here, and I could go quite a bit further, as you can see, but this gives you an idea of that diagramming process at a basic level. So let's talk about reduction analysis in threat modeling. So in reduction analysis, I'm going to break a system down into its parts, which makes it much easier to identify the essential components of each element and take notice of where we might have vulnerabilities and likely points of attack. So just to go through this, I could look at trust boundaries. So any location where the level of trust or security changes. So a trust boundary in your application from, say, an access control perspective would be where a specific role or privilege is required to access a resource or an operation. That would be a change in trust. Data flow path, so looking at the movement of data between locations and what exposures there are that might allow attackers opportunity to capture or breach that data. Input points, locations where external input is received. So in our diagramming example, a web form where we're logging in, or a web form where we're submitting a request that calls back to SQL, that's going to be an area that would be most likely a possibility for attack, a likely target perhaps. Privileged operations, so any activity that requires greater privileges than that of a standard user account, that's going to be a red flag area, an area we'll want to give special attention. Then finally, details about security stance and approach. So essentially just our declaration of security policies, foundations, our assumptions in a given scenario for a service or infrastructure. So after we go through that deconstruction and documentation process, then we want to rank or rate the threats. We can use the DREAD methodology we just talked about, or a high, medium, low rating, for example. So I want to clarify a few things around security controls. So your security controls are the measures for countering or minimizing loss or unavailability of your assets, your services, your apps, etc. And you'll hear the term safeguards and countermeasures. We've used those quite a bit today, and they may seem to be used interchangeably. At the end of the day, the main difference between a safeguard and a countermeasure is safeguards tend to be proactive and countermeasures tend to be reactive. Let's talk about the categories of controls. There are 3 categories of security controls. They're technical, or logical are sometimes called, which involves the hardware or software mechanisms used to manage access. And then you have administrative controls, which are policies and procedures that are designed by the org security policy or other regulations and requirements. Administrative controls, for example, might include hiring practices, background checks, data classifications and labeling, security awareness and training methods. And then you have physical controls. So the physical category are items you can physically touch. So there we're talking about guards, fences, motion detectors, locked doors, sealed windows, lights, laptop locks, etc. So be familiar with these control categories and be able to name off a few in each category, as I just did for you now. So next, let's dig into security control types. So you have deterrent controls. So these are deployed to discourage violation of security policies. Deterrent controls could include audit policies, security awareness training, locks, fences, security badges. They're designed to discourage violation. And then we have preventative controls. These could be technical controls like firewalls or intrusion detection systems. Or it could be a physical control like a fence, or a gate, or a man trap. And technically, there could be some overlap between deterrent controls and preventative controls. The main difference here is deterrent controls really rely on somebody making a decision to not do something, where preventative controls are really designed to actively stop the unwanted behavior. And we have detective controls, which are deployed to discover or detect unwanted activity. So a defining characteristic of detective controls is they really detect the activity after the fact, right? They detect something in progress. Motion detectors, CCTV cameras, audit trails, honeypots. And you'll find some surprising elements listed as detective controls, like mandatory vacations, for example, job rotation. Because if you're rotating people across jobs or in and out on vacations, you're going to be able to establish some patterns there that will allow you to detect behavior based on the presence or absence of certain individuals or circumstances. Then we have compensating controls. Compensating controls provide options to other existing controls to aid in enforcement of the goal. So, for example, let's say your organization requires that personally identifiable information is encrypted in the database. And in fact, it is encrypted in the database. But someone discovers then that the PII data is being transferred across the network in clear text. So a compensating control would be, for example, an additional control to encrypt that data in transit to support the requirement. And you want to make sure on the exam that you understand the key element that defines that control type, and you know a few examples off the top of your head so you can pick those out should you see them in a question. So we're actually not done with control types. Let's keep going here. So we have corrective controls. Corrective controls can range from antivirus that removes malicious files to backup software that automatically restores missing files, to policy-based configuration management that returns a system to its desired configuration after a breach. Next up, we have recovery controls, which are much like corrective controls, but they tend to have more advanced capabilities. Good examples here would include server clustering, VM shadowing, hot sites, warm sites, alternate processing facilities. And finally, we have a directive control, which is intended to confine or control the actions of the subject to force or encourage compliance with security policies. Good examples of a directive control would be security policy requirement, posted notifications, escape route exit signs, just to name a few. So again, make sure you understand the defining characteristic and you can rattle off a few examples before you walk into the exam. Now we're going to talk legal and regulatory, which is an area of the CISSP exam that requires a lot of memorization. I'm going to try to help you focus that in. So at a high level, the topics here include cyber crimes and data breaches, trans-border data flow, licensing and intellectual property requirements, things like trademarks, patents. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Privacy is very important, quite a few laws related to privacy, and then import-export controls, which we'll cover also. So let's start by talking about types of law. So you have three types. You have criminal law, which is just what you think it is. It covers areas like assault, robbery, arson, murder. You have civil law, which covers more business disputes, contract disputes, real estate transactions, employment, estate, the high-dollar lawsuit type of law. And then you have administrative law, which relates to government agencies. They have some leeway to enact administrative law that can cover important topics or areas as mundane as requirements when procuring a phone for an office desk. The CISSP exam focuses on security-related generalities. You're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of the law, but when a question comes up around healthcare-related information, customer healthcare information, you'd need to know that high-tech and HIPAA are laws related to that topic, for example. So let's talk about some of the laws that are likely to come up on the exam. So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, I think the most significant thing about CFAA was it was the first piece of U.S. cybercrime specific legislation. You have federal sentencing guidelines, which were laid out to provide punishment guidelines to help federal judges interpret computer crime laws. The Federal Information Security Management Act, better known as FISMA, had some requirements around formal information security operations for federal government. The Copyright and Digital Millennium Copyright Act, say that 3 times fast, covers literary, musical, and dramatic work, so that's really helpful for artists. Let's talk intellectual property and licensing. So you have trademarks, which cover words, slogans, logos used to identify a company and its products or services. You want to protect your company name, you apply for a trademark. Patents protect the intellectual property rights of inventors, and trade secrets cover intellectual property that is absolutely critical to a business and must not be disclosed for the health of that business. And then there are 4 types of licensing you should be familiar with, and that's contractual, shrink wrap, click-through, and cloud services. So let's talk encryption and privacy. So computer export controls. U.S. companies can't export computer systems to Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. And there are also export controls on encryption. So there are regulations that restrict the export of encryption products outside the U.S. to many countries. When it comes to privacy in the U.S., the basis for privacy rights is laid out in the 4th Amendment of our Constitution. There are many laws related to privacy. I'm going to cover a few of those in just a moment. While the CISSP exam really focuses on the U.S. market, generally speaking, privacy as it relates to the EU may come up because many U.S. companies who have European customers they're all going to be subject to GDPR. And that's most likely to be mentioned on the exam if something comes up around a foreign country. Now, let's talk about other U.S. privacy laws. So when it comes to healthcare, you have Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, better known as HIPAA. You have the Health Info Technology for Economic and Critical Health, better known as HITECH. We have Graham-Leach-Bliley, which applies to financial institutions. If you see a question on the exam related to law and financial institutions, I'd bet it's going to be Graham-Leach-Bliley. The Children Online Privacy Protection App, better known as COPA, and the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, or ECPA. And that's one of 2 laws related to electronic communications that I might expect you'd see on the CISSP exam. The other being the Communications Assistant for Law Enforcement Act. I think I'd be familiar with both of those as well. Now notice that I've put the acronyms here. I find memorizing these acronyms makes everything easier because memorizing all those words is a lot of work. But if I memorize HIPAA, when I see Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, I can pick out the HIPAA, right? So memorizing those acronyms is going to make this a lot easier for you. And you notice how I talked about just the very basic focus of these laws. You're really going to be dealing with generalities, as I mentioned, and that's straight from the official CISSP exam prep guide and matches lines right up with my experience in taking this exam. So you're going to be expected to be familiar with the business continuity planning process and issues that pertain to information security in BCP around things like strategy development, processes, plan approval, plan implementation, training and education. So important you understand the steps of the process, but know that BCP topics are going to cover information security related angles. You're not expected to be a certified business continuity planner here by any means. I give you that same warning I give you for any process. When you're looking at a process, make sure you know the steps in order. Personally, I don't think you're going to see a lot about BCP on the exam. It'll be limited. You want to be familiar with education, so security awareness education and training. So the methods and the techniques for different audiences, periodic content reviews, evaluating your program effectiveness, and you can see a variety of questions here that talk about everything from simple user security awareness training to what's the deepest form of training. So covering things like classroom training all the way to degree programs. But security awareness training is that topic that is ubiquitous when it comes to information security. So as you're preparing for the exam, again, I absolutely recommend you invest in the CISSP official exam study guide. It has lots of questions, flashcards, and searchable material. Domain 1 is covered in chapters 1 through 4 in the official CISSP study guide. You can get it on Amazon. I've got a link for you in the video description. It's just a shade less than $60 US. And that is it for Domain 1. If you enjoyed Part 1, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you get a heads up when Lessons 2 through 8 are published in the very near future. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.